The committee's received no evidence to suggest that the ESO should not be listed as a terrorist organisation, but the bulk of evidence we have received suggests that we should consider extending that listing further to at least the military wing, if not the whole organisation. Evidence from Dr Matthew Levitt before the committee this morning is that there's no meaningful distinction that can be drawn between the ESO and the rest of Hezbollah. Does ASIO disagree with that assessment?
I don't disagree with that assessment.
Okay. Would ASIO have any concerns if the listing was broadened to include either the military wing or the whole organisation?
From ASIO's perspective, and we're not the decision maker here, obviously we call out threats and when asked we give threat assessments, but listing the entire organisation would not impact ASIO's ability to do its job.
Okay. Thank you, that's very helpful. Are you familiar with the case that I cited earlier to the witnesses of Mr Ali Haydar?
Not familiar, Chair.
No, so just to briefly refresh your and the committee members' memory, he was charged with a range of violent offences, but also had possessed material that indicated his support and sympathy for Hezbollah. The judge in the case said that given that the Commonwealth accepts that Hezbollah maintains a militia and that it had deployed forces in Syria to assist the Syrian regime, the Commonwealth did not list Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation, and it would introduce confusion into the area of anti-terrorism if the court were to reach a different conclusion, and therefore declined police application for more extensive supervision of this individual. Is that not a fairly concrete example of the harm that could be caused to Australians by restraining our law enforcement agencies from appropriately supervising people who may have sympathies with terrorist organisations?
I agree with your view on how unhelpful that is for law enforcement.
Thank you. Does ASIO have an assessment that you can share in this forum on the level of support and sympathy for Hezbollah within Australia?
Chair, we have views on that, but we would not talk about those assessments in an unclassified forum.
Fair enough. I have a follow-up question, then I'll offer other colleagues a call should they wish to ask any further questions. Mr Burgess, the position that ASIO takes today, that there would be no harm to your operational capability from a listing of the entire organisation of Hezbollah, is that a different position to one that ASIO has taken in the past, for example, when it was previously considered for listing in 2018?
Thanks for the question, Chair. I'm not sure I could answer that off the top of my head because being the Director General since 2019, I can only say what I know. I will take that question on notice.
Okay, let me maybe help you a little bit there. Has anything changed since the listing of Hezbollah was last considered in terms of your legislative powers that would enable you operationally to overcome the fact that Hezbollah is listed in its entirety?
No. Nothing's changed that's enabled me to do this. We've long had that view that allows us to do things that are otherwise unlawful. There's special powers we can call on that allows us to do that. So we've long had that capability. The only change perhaps is I'm a Director General that wants to focus on our role. I recognise there are others across the official space who have a whole range of other competing views or different interests they need to put forward and be discussed when listings are occurring. And I didn't want ASIO to shape its advice to suit an outcome that others were looking for. I'm happy for them to put their best case forward so decisions can be made based on full information, and our bit in the purest sense is we'll focus on threats to security.
Okay. I will look forward to your answer on notice because longer serving members of the committee will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your statement before the committee today that you would have no concerns and no opposition to the organisation being listed in its entirety is a new statement from ASIO, at least in a public forum, on the question of Hezbollah.
Sure, absolutely.
It has been suggested at times that perhaps there is some advantage to Australia in not listing the full Hezbollah, as many of our allies and like-minded countries have done, due to the fact that they have listed them, the full entity, and that affords us certain freedoms and abilities to operate in Lebanon that they don't have, and in fact it might be to our advantage of our allies that we've done that. So I'll direct this to DFAT, but anyone else who wishes to comment should feel free. Are you aware of any occasion on which, for example, a Five Eyes partner or other close ally has asked Australia not to list Hezbollah in its entirety?
Chair, the simple answer to that is no. Just to verify, under our international financial sanctions regime that Australia applies, under Part 4 of the Charter of the United Nations, Hezbollah is listed in its entirety, and that's a international listing regime, and that's about financing and resources, and it has been listed that way since 2001. And it's been reconfirmed a number of times since 2001. That's the state of play in that particular regime, which is not the criminal code regime. The other thing I'd say to you is we're in a constant dialogue with partners about listing and exchange of information.
So, to your knowledge, it's never been the case that we've been asked not to list it in its entirety, and to the contrary, there's some evidence on the public record, for example, the new administration in the United States, they're urging countries to list Hezbollah in its entirety.
The way I'd answer it is different countries have different listing regimes and different decision-making around it. I think you've heard this before, but it's important that you understand that each national regime is different.
Of course.
So therefore the impacts of listing are different in each jurisdiction. I can give you some... If you want, I can give you...
But that doesn't really answer the question that I pose, which is that some of our friends and allies, for example the United States, have publicly urged all countries to list Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation in its entirety. That's true, isn't it?
I take it on notice and verify it. I'm not sure the exact circumstances where they've done that and who's done it, but I can check and verify.
Great, thank you. And did you want to add to your initial answer?
I was just going to make the offer. I can give you where some of the other countries, like-minded countries, are standing via listing in a general sense, if you'd like that.
Sure.
I'll just get it. So, each of our international partners have their own mechanisms for and consequences resulting from prescribing organisation as terrorist organisation. Just reiterate the point, it's a bit hard to compare directly. The US, UK and Canada apply to Hezbollah its entirety financial sanctions measures, similar to those applied by Australia to Hezbollah in its entirety under Part 4 of the Charter of the United Nations Act, which is the international sanctions I just described previously. New Zealand and France and the Economic Union apply financial sanctions only to Hezbollah's military wing and external security organisation. And while Germany has not designated Hezbollah as a terrorist group, it has banned Hezbollah activities, including the use of display of Hezbollah symbols. This ban also allows for the confiscation and forfeit of assets controlled by Hezbollah or supportive third parties. So there's some of the status for some of our like-minded partners.
I'm not sure how many of you saw the evidence earlier by your colleague Mike Burgess from ASIO, but I asked him whether there would be any harm or concern from ASIO's point of view or any impact on their operations if the Australian government listed Hezbollah in its entirety, and he answered no. Is there any witness here disagree with that assessment? Is there any difference for any of your organisations that you represent that there would be harm caused by listing Hezbollah in its entirety?
I think it's fair to say it will have an impact, but we, at this stage, believe we can manage that impact. But obviously, we're still working through that assessment process, Chair.
And I'll just stick with you for a moment and just understand what you mean by the impact and why it would be manageable.
Well, I think when we step back and look at our engagement with Lebanese authorities, it's not just through the lens of counter-terrorism. We've been there since 2001. We've got a very productive relationship across a wide remit of criminal offending and offences. Lebanon's obviously a very complex environment, so the assessment that we receive from Post and our is that it will register an impact, but again, our assessment at this stage is one that we can manage.
Okay.
Chair, if I can get away from using the word harm, I'd say the listing will have an impact on Australian interests Probably the better place to talk about that would be in a private hearing.
Sure.
But the types of things are threat to Australians or impact on Australians travelling overseas, Australian posts overseas, Australian interests overseas. And in the process for listing, that's what DFAT feeds into the, I heard Senator Keneally talking earlier, feeds into that dialogue process led by Home Affairs.
Sorry, this sounds like a tawdry question. Did you say Australia Post or Australia Posts?
Posts,
Thanks.
not the letters.
Unless any other witness has anything to add to that previous question, I'll move on to a next one.
Senator, Chair Hugh Jeffrey, First Assistant Secretary International Policy Defence. So just again, as to Roger Noble's comments on the word harm, I think that's a word that would require a lot of clarification. But certainly, effect is the word that we use. I mean, were government to change the legal regime under which Australia operates abroad, that will have an effect on how we do things. Of course, that's not taking a position. We would just look to implement the government's decision. Defence is active, as you know, in Lebanon through peacekeeping activities and including from time to time through humanitarian support and in the context of contingency operations. So if you change the legal parameters around which we would engage, of course, that would have an effect.
Yeah.
But I just want, but you'd have to determine whether that's harm or not.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, it self-evidently would have an effect. I mean, that's the purpose of doing so. The question that is relevant for the committee, and I appreciate the constraints you have about being completely candid about it in this forum, and there will be an opportunity to discuss it confidentially if required. Would it be an insurmountable effect? Would it be a seriously deleterious effect? That's what I'm trying to establish.
Chair, I think from Defence's perspective, it will all depend on how what decision is made and how it's implemented.
Okay.
I would argue it's about the articulation of the risk and understanding it, and then whether that's acceptable to the government. That's kind of our role in giving that advice, the decision-making resting with the Minister, and is how I'd kind of answer it.
Okay. All right, I'll move on to another matter, and this is really for the AFP, but others can feel to comment if they wish. I've cited a case a couple of times today to witnesses of Mr Ali Haydar. New South Wales prosecutors sought some control and supervision orders on him. He was a violent criminal offender that also had an association with Hezbollah, for example, posed with photographs, possibly overseas, with automatic weapons, has tattoos, other paraphernalia. How concerned are you that the restrictions sought to be placed upon him by New South Wales Police were not successful because, in the judge's view, the Commonwealth only designating the external security organisation meant that it wasn't clear to the court whether this person's support was for the political wing and aspects of Hezbollah and not the terrorist wing?
Thanks, Joe. Noting it's a public hearing, I suppose the preference is not to delve too much into that operational matter. But what I would say in general, that obviously there's a number of offences under Division 102 that requires the existence of the organisation being designated as a terrorist organisation. It doesn't prevent us investigating and prosecuting. It does make it more difficult. Obviously, in the absence of listing regime, we're required to prove beyond reasonable doubt that an organisation is a terrorist organisation. And I think, and I'll be corrected upon my colleague, I think the only time that we've done that is we've gone back a number of years is in relation to Operation Pendennis and the Bin Brigade group that we proved beyond reasonable doubt that they, in terms of their operation, were designated as a terrorist organisation. And obviously in terms of terrorist organisations that have been designated under the Act, there's been a range of prosecutions over the last couple of years, and we've actively utilised that legislation.
So to be clear, your task and the task of your state police colleagues is easier if an entity has been listed as a terrorist organisation. The bar to clear to prove it in court is lower.
Correct.
Yeah. And so should it be of concern to us then that there is a potential issue where people can make a claim in court that they're only associated with the civilian or political aspects of an organisation, not the terrorist aspects?
It can be a concern, but again, I'm not willing in the public hearing to get into that individual matter. We could discuss that more in the private hearing, Chair.
Okay. All right. Thank you.